Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this video focused on the SBTi's Net-Zero Standard, which is part of a series that we are releasing to accompany the public consultation of our draft Net-Zero criteria. In this video, I'll be focusing on compensation. I'll start with a high-level look at the SBTi's target setting model. Then I'll describe the differences between neutralization and compensation in a little bit more detail. I'll answer some frequently asked questions about compensation and leave you with some of the most important consultation questions that we're asking to address consultation in the context of the net zero standard. To start with, I'll review the net zero target setting model. To set a net zero target that is validated by the SBTi, companies must have interim SBTs that result in emissions abatement in scopes 1, 2, and 3. They also will be setting net zero targets that include deep decarbonization of value chain emissions, paired with carbon removals that neutralize all unabated emissions in the year of net zero. Companies need to meet emissions abatement criteria for both the interim SBT and the longer term net zero target, which is described in another video in this series that I'd encourage you all to watch. And until those emissions abatement criteria are reached, companies have the option of also undertaking optional compensation, and neutralization is not actually incentivized more heavily than compensation during that transition timeframe. So we are encouraging companies to compensate for unabated emissions during the transition to net zero through compensation actions that have quantifiable benefits to climate and co-benefits to people and nature. A high-level look at the mitigation tactics, which are the different kinds of actions that companies can take as part of their climate action strategy. As described in the last slide, emissions abatement are the measures companies take to reduce or eliminate sources of emissions in its value chain. So those are emissions reductions in scopes 1, 2, and 3. Neutralization are the measures companies take to remove carbon from the atmosphere to counterbalance the impact of an unabated source of emissions. And this can be inside or outside the value chain, but it needs to be sufficient to counterbalance any emissions. Compensation are measures that companies take to prevent, reduce, or eliminate emissions and contribute to climate action outside of their value chain. Now for a little bit more detail about the difference between compensation and neutralization. I'll start at the high level, focusing on the actual objective in the context of our framework. The objective of compensation is to accelerate climate action outside a company's value chain. And we know that this is something that is very much needed, especially in the near term, as we're trying to get the world onto a 1.5-degree aligned trajectory from where we are right now. The primary objective of neutralization is to balance residual emissions at the year of net zero in a way that is consistent with a net zero economy. The outcomes that are associated with compensation can cover a pretty wide range: emissions reductions, forest preservation, and other measurable outcomes would be considered eligible and recommended, especially if they are associated with co-benefits. Neutralization really needs to result in carbon removal with sufficient permanence to counterbalance unabated emissions. In terms of indicators, a financial indicator is preferred for compensation, whereas a tons of CO2 indicator is preferred for neutralization. And part of the reason a financial indicator is preferred for compensation is because we do not want to incentivize lower costs and lower quality carbon credits over higher quality carbon credits. And when tons of CO2 is used, companies can essentially purchase the cheapest credits available on the market just to meet a specific number. But we are recommending a financial indicator to be used instead. In terms of carbon credit eligibility, carbon credits would be eligible for compensation, and most traditional carbon credits would not be eligible for neutralization because many carbon credits are not associated with carbon removal, but instead with emissions reduction projects. which carry their own value, but again, play a different role and have a different objective. In terms of the investment timeframe, I mentioned this before, but in many cases, compensation is preferable in the near term to neutralization following the mitigation hierarchy. But ultimately, in the net zero target setting model we've laid out, the only option to neutralize unabated emissions once a company has reached a science-based state of net zero are permanent removals. To address the question even more clearly, why has the SBTi made this distinction? The main reason is that reaching net zero emissions globally requires all sources of emissions to be eliminated or neutralized with an equivalent amount of negative emissions. So to achieve a science-based state of net zero, companies must ensure the same. It's not enough for companies to be reducing their emissions part of the way and relying on carbon removals to do the rest, because ultimately there's a limited amount of carbon removals available, and scaling up carbon removals too much can come with its own side effects that we want to avoid. And part of the point of this framework and model is to really get companies to reduce their emissions by the amount needed for us to successfully reach a net zero economy. We discussed this a little bit earlier, but in more detail on this slide, what is the role of compensation? Really, it's to accelerate climate action outside of a company's value chain. And we see this as an important lever for increasing finance and investment from companies that are ready to take action beyond their own emissions impact. And by directly financing innovative projects and programs, as well as purchasing high quality carbon credits, companies have the opportunity to support climate, but also a wide range of co-benefits. And this is something that we do want to encourage. We would also consider direct investment in R&D that supports rapid learning to be a compensation activity as well. So again, part of the point of breaking this out from neutralization is to recognize that there are a wide range of actions companies can take that can accelerate climate action outside of their value chain, not limited to carbon credits, but including carbon credits. And companies should have flexibility in determining how they want to do that. At the same time, these are not a replacement for reducing a company's emissions, and they don't actually neutralize a company's emissions that are still being emitted. To answer the question of what counts, we've included a couple recommendations. This slide shows the quality conditions that we're recommending for compensation actions, which is that they're measurable, additional, durable, uniquely retired, verified impact, and for carbon credits, vulnerable. These all are somewhat technical terms. The first, measurability, is meant to ensure that stakeholders have some evidence of positive impact. Additionality is important because it demonstrates that the climate mitigation outcomes associated with an action couldn't have happened without the company's support. Durability are mechanisms to address non-permanence. Unique retirement ensures that if carbon credits are used, they're not claimed by more than one actor. Verified impact relates to, again, the confidence of this claim to external stakeholders. And for carbon credits, vulnerability is a term that reflects the impact of carbon credits in a way that I won't get into. And we are asking whether the respondents to the survey agree with these quality conditions as recommendations. We are also including social and environmental conformance conditions for these activities, which are the same as those for neutralization activities in the standard. So those are activities that adhere to a publicly documented social and environmental standard with safeguards. That project and program details are publicly available and auditable, that the projects or programs are developed with involvement and consent from local communities, and that there is a policy to address complaints and grievances that's available to stakeholders that could be affected by that project or program. So we've asked a couple questions in the draft that you can see and in the survey that we're asking you to fill out. But really, the main question that we're wondering is what is the best role for the SBTi to play in this space? So we would love your feedback on, in your opinion, what's the best role for the SBTi to scale up adoption of corporate finance commitments in the context of the net zero standard. And we're also asking if your company would be interested in setting a compensation target under this model so that we can better understand. Thank you very much for listening. Please do tune in to the other videos, which include important background on other topics in the standard. And we look forward to your comment in the consultation.